In this video, I'm going to briefly cover the structure and function of the central nervous system. Remember that your nervous system is made of nerve tissue, one of the 4 types of tissue found in the human body. And we're very familiar with the neuron, the type of cell that carries the nerve impulse from one part of your body to another. But you're probably not so familiar with the types of cells found alongside the neuron, and they can be seen by all these little dots in this slide of nerve tissue because that represents the nucleus of all these other cells that are found around this big, very clear neuron that you can see stained in the center of this slide. These other types of cells are called neuroglial cells or glial cells, and they provide other functions that help keep your nervous tissue healthy, keep your neurons functioning the way they should. There are 4 main types of glial cells. The first type is the astrocyte, which actually provides structural support. It's shown down here in the picture. But it's also got a very important role regulating the concentration of ions and nutrients in the nervous tissue surrounding the neurons. And it is an important part of what's known as the blood-brain barrier. Because you can see here the astrocyte wraps its foot processes around capillaries and prevents materials from moving out of capillaries and into the brain. In other parts of your body, we are having various molecules slide in between the cells that make up the capillary walls. Those molecules slide through the capillaries and enter the interstitial fluid of the other tissues. But it's not safe to have that happen in your brain. Your brain needs to be kept protected from hormones and other drug chemicals and things that are floating through your body. And so there's a blood-brain barrier provided by the tightness of the capillary walls and then a second layer of the astrocyte cell membranes of the foot processes that keep materials in the bloodstream and don't allow it to enter your brain or spinal cord. This can be a problem for doctors because they have to come up with unique ways to cross the blood-brain barrier, but in general, it's a positive thing. Then the second type of glial cell is the epidermal cells. These cells are found on the inner lining of spaces inside your brain called ventricles. And these cells are ciliated, so you can see the epidermal cell with the cilias here. The cilia will move back and forth in a rowing motion and help circulate fluid, the cerebrospinal fluid that is found in and around your brain and spinal cord. I'll talk about the cerebrospinal fluid in a couple more slides, but it's very important, again, for maintaining homeostasis in your central nervous system, and the epidermal cell keep things moving. Microglial cell are a third type of glial cells, and these are phagocytic. They can engulf and eat and destroy things like bacteria and other foreign invaders, or just waste products and cellular debris from old cells or cells that have been working hard in the brain tissue. So they're sort of the cleanup crew. And the last type is the oligodendrocyte, which is the cell that provides the myelin sheath in the central nervous system. These also have foot processes that wrap around the axons of neurons, as we see over here, and provide that insulation that allows nerve impulses to jump their way down the axon instead of having to transfer through every little piece of cell membrane on those very long axons. So the central nervous system, of course, includes the brain and the spinal cord, and its key function is to analyze information that comes in from the sensory receptors and then act on it by sending messages to muscles and glands. Your central nervous system are composed of what we call interneurons, which are really connecting neurons, found both within the brain and the spinal cord. You also will find cell bodies of the sensory and motor neurons that are from the peripheral nervous system or out there in the body. The cell bodies are sort of held safe inside the central nervous system, whereas the axons are going out into the body structure itself. So in this diagram of the spinal cord over here, we see a sensory neuron coming in, an interneuron here in between, and then a motor neuron sending a message out to a muscle. Starting with the brain, I think you realize that the brain does a variety of extremely important things. It interprets the sensations that come in from our sensory neurons, give us, a perception of what's going on in the outside world. Memory is stored in our brain. It does reasoning and decision making. It coordinates muscular movements, takes care of all the automatic processes. Those are also known as visceral body functions. And of course, determines your personality and many other aspects that we don't tend to think of as being and so carefully connected to our own brains. The brain has four main parts. These are known as the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brain stem, and the cerebellum. And the brain cells, the neurons in the brain, interact in unique ways that create areas with distinct functions. So it's a very organized structure. It's not just a bunch of neurons thrown together, but they are organized with the same role being carried by neurons that are in the same area. And we call those concentrated areas that are one function as neuronal pools. So here's an illustration showing these four parts of the brain. The cerebrum is the largest part. It's the part on the outside. The very, very outside edge of this is known as the cerebral cortex. This is the part of the brain that is much bigger in humans than other animals, and it's where we get our ability to think and analyze and create and have emotions and all that stuff that make us uniquely human. The diencephalon is the second major part of the brain, and it's sort of in here in the middle. It's made up of two main parts, the thalamus here on top and the hypothalamus underneath. The thalamus is very important in determining the pathways for sensory information. It basically sends the nerve impulses that are coming from the senses this way and that way in the brain so they get to the appropriate place in the cerebrum for analysis. The hypothalamus is critical for many, many different homeostasis processes, maintaining body temperature, for example. And together with the hypothalamus, we have certain glands, such as the pituitary gland down here. We have the hypophysis, is sort of a fancy name for pituitary gland, that also is, we'll talk a lot more about when we get to the hormones. The brain stem sometimes gets called the reptile brain or the lizard brain because it sort of takes care of the basic functions that we have in common with all animals, things like a drive to feed and to sleep, to reproduce, to fight or run away from a situation. It is made up of three parts, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, and things like your respiratory center or the main center for triggering underlying heartbeat, waking yourself up. Those things all happen from the brain stem. And then finally, the cerebellum, sort of tucked in here underneath the occipital lobe of your cerebrum. This is very, very important in coordinating your muscles. It helps you maintain a good posture and just move in a balanced fashion as you use your muscles to move your body around the world. This particular slide is showing how the specialized neuronal pools are organized in the cerebrum. You can see that we have, certain areas that have been highlighted that are taking responsibility for certain things. Our prefrontal cortex is involved in planning and judgment and some of our emotional reactions to things. We have a motor cortex in the middle of the brain here that's in charge of movement. We have a sensory cortex that is in charge of interpreting what's going on in our senses. Sight and visual memory is here in the occipital lobe, the back of the brain. There are specific areas for hearing and for speech and for memory. And so this is just an example of how your brain's neurons are consolidated and specialized in different parts of the cerebrum. As I mentioned before, inside the brain there are spaces known as ventricles, which are basically cavities, open spaces, but they're not completely empty because they're filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And these ventricles are important to provide some cushioning and shock absorption if your brain gets shaken around in your head. They also increase the buoyancy of the brain. They decrease the perceived weight of the brain from about 1,300 grams to just 25 grams. So the brain is basically floating in fluid like it's on a waterbed. And this is helping prevent pressure building up along the bottom of the brain that would happen if it was just sort of sitting on your bottom of your cranium, because remember, the brain is completely encased in a bone box. The cerebral spinal fluid is also important for maintaining chemical balance, both of all the nutrients, bringing nutrients in, bringing waste materials out, and also providing the various ions we need for triggering those nerve impulses. Just to look a little bit deeper at the cerebral spinal fluid, it is a clear fluid made from blood plasma by specialized epithelial cells, which are known as the choroid plexus. It circulates through the central canal, which is basically a hole down the middle of your spinal cord, and the ventricles, which I mentioned, are these spaces inside the brain, and then the subarachnoid space, which is the space between the skull and the brain itself. And we'll talk about them when we talk about meninges, being pushed, as I mentioned before, by these epidermal cells that have cilia. So the brain, if we think about how the brain is, think about how the cerebral spinal fluid, it would be going, the arrows tell you it's going around the brain this way, and then it would be traveling down to the bottom of the spinal cord and come back up through the central canal, circulate through these ventricles in the center of the brain, and then back out again to finish going around the other way. Continually moving, about 200 milliliters a day is made and in circulation at any one moment. The cerebral spinal fluid, as I mentioned before, provides cushioning and maintains the ion balance and the nutrient balance and provides pathways for waste disposal. So it's very important for the maintaining of health of your central nervous system. So moving on to the spinal cord, it's going to connect with your brain via the brain stems. Basically, there's not a stopping point where one thing becomes something else, but your brain stem morphs into the spinal cord. The spinal cord proper, if we wanted to say a starting point, it starts at the foramen magnum, which is this hole out of the back of your skull. So once the nerves have passed that hole opening, we would say now it's in the spinal cord. On the other side, it would be considered the brain stem. And it actually ends higher in the back than you may think. It ends between the first and second lumbar vertebrae, but spinal nerves continue from that end and sort of spread out as they go like a broom at the very, very bottom of your spinal column. The spinal cord contains both gray matter, which are cell bodies, and white matter, which is the myelinated axons of the many, many cells that are traveling through to make up your nervous system. The spinal cord has two main functions. It is what brings impulses to and from the central nervous system, from the peripheral nervous system, or from the nerves in the body. And it also is where your spinal reflexes occur. In a spinal reflex, information comes in from a sensory nerve and then goes right back out again without having to go to the brain for processing. So you don't have to think about a reflex. It just happens without conscious thought. Reflexes are used for safety, to keep your body from getting into dangerous situations. They keep us from tripping. They catch us when we start to fall, or keep our hands, or remove our hands quickly from a very hot surface or a very painful situation. Your spinal cord has both going up or ascending and coming back down, descending nerve tracts, which are basically bundles of nerves. Sensory information is moving up, and then the motor impulse is coming down to muscles and glands. From each vertebrae in your spinal column, you have a pair of spinal nerves, one going out one side and one out the other. So there's 31 pairs of spinal nerves coming out in each one, 2 from each of your vertebrae, to carry impulses to and from the body. Here's a model of the spinal cord, just identifying some of those tracks. And you can see, again, they're very organized and specialized for voluntary and fine movement. We have these two sections over here, whereas for balance and posture, we've got some other, small areas in your spinal column. On the sensory side, for fine touch and vibration, we have this big section here. Whereas for crude touch and bigger things of pain and pressure or temperature, we've got little sections of nerves there. So that nervous system has been tracked. We know what nerves travel together, how they have a common function. And again, this is related to this idea of organization within the central nervous system and neuronal pools. Then last, I want to go over the way that your body is designed to provide protection for the central nervous system, since it is such an essential system. Without your central nervous system, your body would not be able to function. There are 5 layers of physical protection. The bone itself of both the cranium, the skull, and the vertebral column surround the central nervous system. So there's a hard layer between your soft, squishy nervous tissue and the outside of the outside world. Then there are 3 meninges, which are membranes that surround the central nervous system, both the brain and the spinal cord. And then, of course, the cerebral spinal fluid, which circulates throughout the central space and between the bones and membranes, so that your brain floats in the central nervous, or floats in the cerebral spinal fluid, and that provides, as I said, some protection and shock absorption. Looking more closely at the arrangement of these membranes or meninges, you have the skull bone shown here in this diagram. Directly between the first layer, directly underneath the bone, is what's known as dura mater, and that's a very thick membrane. We'll see it in our brain dissection. And so it's our first outer layer of sort of wrapping around the soft tissue that makes up the nervous system. And then we'll skip over the middle one and go right to the one that's closest to the nervous tissue, or the pia mater, which you can see is just really stuck right on top of all those neurons. Very, very hard to sort of distinguish it from the brain itself. And then in between the dura mater and the pia mater, we have the arachnoid mater, and it's named that because it sort of has these web-like connections from the top to the bottom. And this, as you can see, is another open space. It's another place where it is the place where cerebral spinal fluid is moving outside of the brain and spinal cord, and so the fluid is moving through sort of these openings in these 3 layers of meninges. So to check for understanding, can you compare the function of the neurons and the neural glial cells, how they're different? Can you describe how the neurons of the brain and spinal cord are organized based on body functions and give a specific example of what types of functions are being covered by groups of neurons? Can you describe the arrangement of nerves in the spinal cord? Which ones are carrying information up? Which ones are bringing information down? And can you discuss these different layers of protection for the central nervous system? If not, go back and check over those parts of the video again so that you'll have the notes you need.